What's up, guys? Today we're going to talk about 5 mid-rangers that I think you should still check out. If you're not into older flagships, I think you guys might like some of these phones, and they're actually a little bit cheaper than they were earlier this year. So one of the first phones is the Poco X3 Pro. This is one of my favorite phones. I actually think this phone is slightly better than the successor, the Poco X4 Pro, simply because the CPU is better and it's cheaper, so it's just better for gaming. And I think that's what attracts a lot of people, especially if you're in the market overseas where this phone is also very popular. This is just a great product, so it's just one of my go-to phones also for the IR blaster. But the design on here, not my favorite, but I think it's fine for what it is. It's just a plastic build. It's IP53 dust and splash proof, and it looks fine. It doesn't feel like super cheap. It actually has a pretty good weight to it. It is an IPS LCD panel, 120 Hz HDR10 at 6.67 inches. It is 1080p 395 for the PPI. Overall, pretty good screen to body ratio. It has the punch hole in the middle. It gets fairly somewhat bright. I don't actually have any issues with the display. No, it's not an OLED or anything like that, but it is a pretty high quality IPS panel, and like I said, it's 120 Hz, so it's buttery smooth. This phone is capable of being upgraded to Android 12 with, of course, the MIUI 13. This phone, the real highlight with this phone is the Snapdragon 860 processor and the Adreno 640 GPU. Basically, this is an excellent gaming phone. PUBG will run at max settings really well. It plays pretty much anything really well at high settings, so I'm always really impressed with performance on this phone. And you can find this easily for around like the $200 price point. This phone is actually very cheap. You also get micro SD card support, 128 gigs of internal storage, 6 or 8 gigs of RAM as well too. And then you have some pretty impressive sounding stereo speakers on here as well. They get pretty loud. This phone also has a headphone jack, which is pretty awesome as well. And like I was saying earlier, you do have an IR blaster on here, and you also have NFC on here as well. The fingerprint scanner is physical and it is side mounted, and it works flawlessly. So the cameras on here, not my favorite on the list, but they are pretty good cameras and good lighting. I just think there are other cameras on this list that are better, but it has a 48 megapixel standard, an 8 megapixel ultra wide, a 2 megapixel macro, and then a 2 megapixel depth sensor. It shoots in 4K 30, and then it has a 20 megapixel selfie cam that shoots in 1080p. So basically, it's a pretty good shooter, as you can tell from the shots. My only issue is sometimes I have to kind of edit the colors. The colors don't come out how I want them. But it gets you good detail, good dynamic range. The ultra wide is fine. The macro is meh, because the 2 megapixel macro cameras just aren't good. But other than that, it's a pretty good shooter. So another highlight with this phone is actually the massive battery. It's a 5,160 milliamp battery with some pretty fast charging. So it's 33 watt charging on here as well too, which is pretty impressive. No wireless charging, but battery life can easily get you well over 6 hours. So this is definitely an all-day phone, at least for me. So a very impressive phone. Next is the iPhone SE 2020. I personally prefer this one over the new SE 2022, simply because there was really not a big upgrade with that phone, right? The newest one. That's why I really didn't bother rushing out to get that phone, because this one is $200 cheaper, right? Because this one's going for 200 bucks. That one's going for like 400, I think 430 or 20, something like that. It's just ridiculous. It's just this phone with 5G. There's no battery improvements. Yeah, the CPU is better, but the CPU in this phone is still extremely good anyway. So this one is just a better deal because it's much cheaper. So SE 2020, awesome phone. Again, with the sort of dated design, which honestly, if you're an Apple fan, you probably don't care. It is a glass and metal design, IP67 dust and water resistant. It is a 4.7 inch Retina IPS display. It's 720p plus 326 for the PPI. The screen is honestly fine for what it is. It's a pretty nice screen. It's pretty sharp. No, it's not OLED or anything like that, but for what it is, it's a pretty decent screen. Yes, it's got chunky bezels and stuff like that, but the benefit with the body design is that it has Touch ID, and a lot of people like that physical home button and stuff like that. So that's also could be a benefit for you. Of course, this is going to get iOS 16 and stuff like that, but the highlight with this phone is still this A13 chip. It's just blazing fast. It's just extremely fast when going in and out of applications. Playing games. I mean, just run the Geekbench scores, you'll see that it's still very competitive. as far as, you know, even comparing it to flagship phones, honestly. Of course, you have 64 gigs of internal storage, 3 gigs of RAM. This phone has stereo speakers, which aren't like super loud, but they do a pretty decent job. You do have NFC on here. Like I said, Touch ID is pretty big for people who really like it. And also, this is a very compact phone, so I think people who prefer smaller phones and don't want something really big, you'll actually really like the size of this phone. Also, another highlight, and I think something that has aged a little bit with this phone, is that it's a 12 megapixel sensor, but that's it. There's no ultra wide, there's no telephoto. Shoots in 4K, 24, 30, 60, and then a 7 megapixel selfie cam. The shots actually come out really good on here. I would say almost kind of like flagship quality. I mean, it takes some really great shots. I'm always impressed, especially with the video on here. But like the thing is, like, it's only one lens, right? But video on here, images still look really good on here. As far as just your point and click, I think I'm always pretty impressed with image quality on here, as far as the color, dynamic range and stuff like that. It's a very consistent shooter. You also have on here somewhat not that great battery life, but not terrible. So it's got a 1,821 milliamp hour battery and then 18-watt charging with wireless charging. So here's the thing about the battery. It's 4 hours and 30 minutes ish for screen on time. So basically not exactly a full day, but you can buy a battery case for this phone, honestly, and you can get more out of it. But yeah, just note that, especially if you're a heavy user, you can definitely kill this phone before the day's over. But I think it's still a great bargain for 200 bucks. Next is the Pixel 5a 5G. This is probably one of the most solid mid-rangers on the list as far as just having the overall total package. I just really like this device here. So it's actually got an aluminum frame and aluminum back, so it's actually a very sturdy, nice feeling phone. It's IP68 7 dust and water resistant, and it has a OLED display at 6.34 inches, and it is 1080p 415 for the PPI. So there's no high refresh rate on this phone, unfortunately, but the screen on here is silky smooth still. It's a really nice screen. It looks really great. And also, with just the stock version of Android, this phone, performance wise, it makes it feel still really fast. This phone, of course, when the benefit to getting these Pixel phones, that you get updates really fast. So when Android, you know, the next Android comes out version, you're gonna be first to get that update, which I really love. And it has the Snapdragon 765G and the Adreno 620, which is a pretty good processor, I think, for your average person who's not going, you know, crazy gaming and stuff like that. This does a pretty good job for casual use, you know, just browsing web, casual gaming, stuff like that. It's a very fast phone. It's not slow at all, actually. No SD card support, 128 gigs of internal storage, and 6 gigs of RAM. This phone has pretty great sounding stereo speakers as well too, and I'm really happy that they actually kept the headphone jack with this phone, so you do have that on here. You also have NFC. The fingerprint scanner is on the back, and it works really great as well. But the highlight of this phone is that camera. So it's a 12.2 megapixel camera with a 16 megapixel ultra wide. It shoots in 4K 60, and then you have an 8 megapixel selfie cam that shoots in 1080p 30. Basically, this takes phenomenal photos, flagship quality photos for the price that they're asking for, which is typically around 400 bucks. It takes great nighttime photos as well too. It's just an overall awesome shooter. So skin tones look great. I always love taking photos with Pixel phones because I just love the image processing that these phones do, and they just look really great to me. So I really like the cameras. The cameras are definitely the highlight. I would say my favorite shooter on the list, actually. So this phone also has pretty good battery life. So 4,680 milliamp battery life, battery with 18-watt charging on here. Basically, this is another phone that can easily get you 6 hours of screen on time. So definitely all day battery life, and you also have that 5G as well too. So definitely this is a very solid phone that I think kind of came out and was really slept on, actually. Next is the Samsung Galaxy A52 5G. I still like this because it's come down in price. I know there's an A53, but this is, I think, a better deal because that A53 wasn't such a big jump, you know, from this phone, and this one has the headphone jack still, and they took it away, I believe. But I really like the design on here. I think it still looks really good for a mid-ranger. You can find these for around $300 to $400. It's IP67 dust and water resistant. It is a plastic phone, but it still feels really solid. One of the best things about this phone is actually the display. I think it has the best display on this list. It's the Super AMOLED 120 Hz HDR10 Plus display at 6.5 inches. It's 1080p 407 for the PPI. Basically, it's a very beautiful display. Like I said, best display on the list. Super smooth, beautiful colors, pretty slim bezels on here. I really like the display on here. And of course, another highlight is the One UI software on here. This phone is upgradable to Android 12 One UI 4.1. And it's just super smooth with a ton of features, which we go over on the channel all the time. It's got the Snapdragon 750G, Adreno 619. Again, not a flagship, quality chip. It's a mid-range chip. So gaming on here is pretty good, but it's mostly for casual gamers. So it gets the job done. Also, you have micro SD card support, 128 gigs of internal storage, and 6 gigs of RAM. Stereo speakers sound really great. It's packed with NFC. Fingerprint scanner under the display, very fast on here as well too. And I think the cameras, I think this would be maybe my second or third favorite cameras. I swap between this and the SE. So it's a 64 megapixel standard and a 12 megapixel ultra wide, but this has more options, so I will go with this one as my second favorite actually. It's a 5 megapixel macro and a 5 megapixel depth. It shoots in 4K 30 with a 32 megapixel selfie cam that also shoots in 4K 30. Basically, you're getting some really great photos on here as well. Really good detailed shots, good dynamic range, good color, great video. It's just an overall very nice shooter, I think, for $400. I don't think anybody would be, unhappy with the image quality here. As far as the battery life, it's a 4,500 milliamp battery with 25-watt charging, and you essentially can get 6 hours of screen on this phone as well too, which is pretty good. So I wouldn't say that the battery life is bad at all on this phone. So essentially one of my favorite phones, especially if you were a Samsung fan. Alright guys, last on the list is going to be the Redmi Note 11 Pro plus 5G. This is a very overall very solid phone going for $400, and I just really like this phone as well too. So it's got a very nice design. I think one of my favorite designs on this list actually. Looks like it costs more than what you pay for. So it's got a glass back on here. It's IP53 dust and splash proof. It's got a beautiful 6.67 inch Super AMOLED display. It's 120 Hz HDR10 plus. It actually has a peak brightness at 1200 nits, so it's a very bright display. It's 1080p 395 for the PPI. Again, another very beautiful display. You also have on here the Android 11. This will get Android 12 with the MIUI update. Now, this one has the MediaTek 920 processor and the Mali G68 GPU. Basically, it's not a super powerful phone as far as the benchmark scores go. So this wouldn't be my option for like gaming. This is more for the casual user. But performance-wise, it is still a very fast phone as far as just doing your basic tasks. It does have micro SD card support, 128 gigs of internal storage, 6 or 8 gigs of RAM. You also have stereo speakers, which actually are very loud. The headphone jack is still on here. This has NFC and the infrared port. Physical fingerprint scanner on here, side mounted. One of the highlights, the real highlights with this phone is a very impressive and very big camera on here. It's a 108 megapixel standard on here, so you get some extremely detailed shots on this phone. You also have 8 megapixel ultra wide and a 2 megapixel macro. It shoots in 4K 30 with a 16 megapixel selfie cam that shoots in 1080p 60. Image quality on here is quite good. I really do like the 108 megapixel camera, especially if you blow it up on the computer. You really get to see like a ton of detail with the camera on here, which is something that I really like. As far as the battery life, it is a pretty good battery life. So it's got a 4,500 milliamp hour battery. Here's the crazy thing about this phone. This phone comes with a 120 watt charger. Now they claim that you can get 100% from 15 minutes. It is absolutely nuts. Even if like this phone charges so fast, it's absolutely crazy. So I just love just charging stuff up with this phone. So the charger on here is nuts. I love that it comes in the box too. Like that's nuts. But yeah, so the charger is like definitely a highlight. If you like stuff to charge like super fast, man, this thing is blazing fast. And also the battery life is really good, so that's really awesome as well too. So yeah guys, this is a pretty solid choice. So be sure to let me know, what do you guys think, and I will catch you guys in the next one.